Yeah, it is being recorded. So from me, a good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. For some of you, maybe good morning or good evening. Thanks for joining the webinar, the ESVD 2024 update and paving the ways towards COP16. We had over 500 people who subscribed to the webinar today. So it's great to see that you've all joined us here today already. And I'm very happy and excited to be here. And as I said, people will slowly still be coming in, but we have a fully packed webinar, so we get started now. And also nice for you if you can turn your camera on, but keep your microphone muted until the Q&A session later today. Before we delve into the depths of the ESVD and fly like a bird over the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is now rebranded the Biodiversity Plan, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Vincent Hof, and today I'll be the moderator, but in everyday life, I'm working in the capacity of Program Officer and Ecosystem Services Specialist for the Foundation for Sustainable Development. We host the Ecosystem Services Valuation Database, the ESVD, which is an important topic today, and also the Ecosystem Services Partnership, ESP, which is the largest global partnership connecting practitioners and experts in the field of ecosystem services. We would like everybody to mute if possible. Thank you. And we organized this webinar loosely around the finalization of the ESVD 2024 update for the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Safety, LNV in short. So I would say a special thanks to Esmee Kooijman, who is here today, Alexander Verkerk and other colleagues at LNV for granting us this project and for collaborating with us over the past years. Additionally, this webinar is also organized to prepare ourselves and to start thinking about COP16 in Colombia at the end of the year and the pivotal role that ecosystem services, the benefits that humans receive from nature, and the monetary valuation of ecosystem services can play to achieve the targets set by the Biodiversity Plan. Then next slide, please. And having said that, to keep in mind some short-term household notices, the webinar is being recorded, so please take the necessary adjustments if you don't want to be recorded yourself. And as I said, I always like to see faces, so I encourage you, or we all encourage you, to put your camera on so that we are not speaking to the void. And as you may have noticed in the invitation, it's very fully packed during a busy time of the year, so we have 1 hour to guide you through. We also have a Q&A section later in the webinar. And if you could please mute yourself, thank you. And there's a Q&A chat at the top of your screen, somewhere center left. And there you can pose all your questions. We will collect these questions and address them in an interactive session later in the webinar. And we're really looking forward to this part. And we really encourage active participation during the Q&A, where you are invited to voice your questions and comments yourself by unmuting yourself. But for now, please mute yourself. As I mentioned, the webinar is loosely based around the LNV project and the update. And the data update, as I've just heard from co-capacity from Joost Lieshout, has just been completed. So the new data is all online, which is really great. The recording will indeed be available. And we also will discuss the value transfer tool and the free and open source character of the ESVD, which Victoria and Luc will touch upon in about 15 minutes. But before, we would like to touch upon the larger narrative first, namely the role of ecosystem services and monetary valuation of ecosystem services within the Biodiversity Plan and how it can inform decision makers, both public and private, to account for nature within their policies, regulations, and also assessment frameworks. And this is not a trivial thing because we are in a biodiversity crisis, because we are not sufficiently taking care of the natural world around us. And we are not truly integrating the value of nature. Recently, a report came out that 55% of world's GDP is dependent on nature and its ecosystem services, which account for more or less 58 trillion. And I cannot really grasp this number, but if you stack $1 bills from the moon and back 7 times, you get to about 58 trillion. And I think it would be very safe to say that if we don't incorporate the risks we are running here, the other 45% of GDP might not stay unaffected. And this means that we run systemic risks throughout the economy if we don't account for the enormous value of nature. and we have to include all the values of ecosystem services. And we are currently not doing this. If the could please mute your, thank you, or if others could please mute. We need to make these invisible values of nature visible and to strategize that our economies are embedded in nature. COP16 will be addressing the importance of nature and of ecosystem services, and it aims to substantialize this in institutional frameworks and actions. And an important theme is the strategic implementation of the Biodiversity Plan in the design of the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, the NBSAPs in short, but how to align ecosystem services with the NBSAPs for nature, conservation and biodiversity, and how to leverage ecosystem services in governmental decisions and strategies. And also very important, how can ecosystem services address the 200 billion finance gap, as pointed out by target 19 of the Biodiversity Plan, to make a positive business case, which does not only benefit stakeholders, but also nature, private stakeholders, but also nature and the broader public. And these questions will be addressed in an interview by my colleague Mieke Siebers and Caroline van Leenders. Caroline van Leenders is Senior Process Manager at the Dutch Enterprise Agency and is also affiliated to the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Safety. She's co-founder of the TNFD and was part of COP15, so the previous COP. And we as FSD have worked together and are still working together with Caroline on various projects. Mieke Siebers is the Executive Director of FSD. She has been spearheading FSD's work on economic valuation of nature, and she moderated the Business and Nature Summit in Milan 2023. So both share great drive to creating a 21st century economy that fits within the planetary boundaries. And I would now like to give the floor to both of them to expand on this and to share their experiences. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Vince, for this kind introduction. And thank you all for joining us. Caroline, I'm so happy to see you here. So let's start on the topic of Ecosystem Services Valuation and the Biodiversity Plan. Caroline, from your perspective, how do ecosystem services and their valuation contribute to achieving the targets outlined in the Biodiversity Plan, formerly known as the Global Biodiversity Framework? And from your perspective, what role do they play in guiding these policy decisions at both national and international levels?
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here, and hello to all. We've been working together because I think it is an important topic, ecosystem services and their valuation. But maybe first to think about ecosystem services and what could be their role in the work we are doing on biodiversity in general. And since the Montreal deal was made, we did a little survey together to see how ecosystem services can be of value for the different goals. And there's overall goals for the CBD. Ecosystem services and their valuation can help to get a better idea and an understanding of the value of the nature that still has to be conserved and to be kept. But they can also play a great role if we think about the sustainable use of biodiversity and nature, and also the need to restore nature. So another overall goal, ecosystem services and having an insight into their value can be of help. And you can see that translated because there are many targets now with these overall goals. There are 23 targets. And in almost every target, ecosystem thinking and then later valuation can be of help. Whether you talk about what areas to protect the most because of their value, if you think about spatial planning and the value of different ecosystem services in different places in your country, or whether you think about cities and how ecosystem services can help for climate adaptation. And also, if you think about connecting the goal of biodiversity and climate better, getting a better understanding in the relationships between climate and biodiversity, there's of course also ecosystem services can play a big role and be of help. one of the ecosystem services is to store CO2. So here you go. These are overall goals, but of course, especially because we're talking about monetary value evaluation or monetary valuation of ecosystem services, there are different goals within different targets, financial targets, and of course, they can even the payment for ecosystem services or the thinking of how to pay also and invest in ecosystem services for those goals. They can be, of course, this work can be of particular help.
Yeah. It's a good thing that what you pointed out, that we are oftentimes we are very much focusing on the specific targets under the biodiversity plan, the framework that has been the Kunming-Montreal framework, but there are 3 overall goals on conservation, restoration, and a sustainable use. And it's indeed very valuable to keep that in mind, that is what we're actually aiming at when developing the plans within the targets. So circling back to that.
Maybe one small extra thing, there's also a target, what they call access and benefit sharing.
Yes.
And maybe even, and that's a very, well, it's a bit of a complex discussion. We're not going to get into it or goal you have, but maybe even ecosystem services can even be considered that what is access and benefit sharing on ecosystem services. But let's not get into that discussion. But yeah.
It is a very interesting point indeed. If you look at target 22, 23 on access and benefit sharing, you could look at that from different perspectives. But yeah, circling back to the part what you mentioned on monetary valuation. This is what we do within ESVD, of course, and that is what this webinar is also about. We've worked together a lot throughout the last years in learning how this can be of use. Could you elaborate a bit on the use of this monetary valuation as a means to bridge the gap between finance and these targets of the CBD?
Well, I think the big problem is that nature doesn't have a voice in most of the economic and financial decisions and models. So for me, the work on ecosystems and their services, which is very people-oriented, of course, nature has its intrinsic value. There's also other living animals and plants that live off ecosystem services, not only people. But even so, if you think about our economic and financial model, there's one language there that talks, and that's money. So the way to make the monetary value of ecosystem services, to make them visible, is a way to talk about them and to be able to make different kind of calculations. And I think that's what we have done, or what you have done, for example, with the ASN Bank, looking at their investments, but the data is also used for other investments being made by other financials. And you do see that there's a high value of certain ecosystem services that are mostly publicly financed, publicly paid for, and there are services that are very in the private sector. So to get a bit, and you get an idea of numbers. So it is not about the specific until what two numbers behind the comma or something like that. But if you look at what kind of damage sometimes is done to certain ecosystem services because of certain ways of, for example, agriculture, or infrastructure, you get an idea about how much damage is done to certain and sometimes it's even 10-fold or 100-fold more damage being done to certain ecosystem services compared to the return being made.
Yeah.
So it gives you an understanding of how valuable certain ecosystem services are, like, for example, pollination, which is one, or clean water, water purification. These kind of things they are paid normally by public money. They have a very high value, so you get a more better understanding on. And if you want to invest, who should pay for them, who is making a return on them.
Yeah, exactly. What indeed brings us to this financing gap that Vince already mentioned, and I love that you say it is actually very much about the order of magnitude of the impact when we invest in certain areas, or it's about understanding what is actually happening in that ecosystem and what can we expect. And from that understanding, these trade-offs that we are making in preferring one service over another. And going to that financing gap that Vince already mentioned, in setting up and designing the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, we are also in the process, or not we policymakers, but we as humanity.
We are.
We as the
as
bigger group of us
yes.
engaging. We are also in the process of drafting and designing these biodiversity finance plans. If you look at ecosystem service valuation, and you already mentioned it a bit, but what strategies can be employed to mobilize financial resources or design the new financial instruments that are needed?
Well, I mean, we have just started, so I'm not saying that I have all the answers, because I think we are all in this together, and I would really love also to hear from others that are in this call. Are you working, if you're working on a biodiversity finance plan connected to the targets in your NBSAP, if you're thinking about especially the financial targets, please reach out if you have knowledge and experience to share or questions. If it is specifically about ecosystem services and their value, we will start a process where we get support also to make our biodiversity plan. But maybe as a way of thinking, if you look at, for example, certain ecosystem services that are paid for by governments, like good water, clean water, or maybe pollination or CO2 storage, there's a lot of public funding going into different ecosystem services, although they are not named like that. And you can maybe find synergies in this public funding. And we have a few examples in the Netherlands where we make programs that are as well good for water, as for nature, as for pollination. So you can look for synergies in funding if you want to scale up the financing for those kind of ecosystem services. But you can also look at blended finance. You can look at how can you combine private and public money better to invest in nature, and then the monetary value of ecosystem service can help you to make a financial structure for a certain area, because these ecosystem services, the ecosystems themselves are local. They are located somewhere, and as you know very well as the ESVD, the monetary value is not the same everywhere. It is localized. So you have to think about investing also locally on the scale of an ecosystem, a catchment, for example, or a forest, or an island, or a city, a certain scale, and see if you can combine certain investments, public and private, and see whether you can, by combining financial flows, whether you can make a blended finance structure. And maybe the last thing to say is ecosystem services can also help you to make markets more nature inclusive. If you start to pay farmers for ecosystem services, if they take better care for the soils, for the soil biodiversity, and then they have to pay less for the land, or if they get a better price for their products. So you can make markets nature inclusive, you can bundle public flow. So there are different ways where you can come up with certain strategies that you can use in your biodiversity finance plan, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. Understanding this ecosystem, what you mentioned in the beginning, is also helping you to design the right blended finance constructions. See where payment for ecosystem service schemes can add value, or where we can redirect harmful incentives or subsidies, such as also mentioned under one of the targets.
And even get to learn your stakeholders, because that's what you also really found in the work that you did with the ASN Bank, there's lots of local communities taking care of ecosystems and their services. And there's also, as there is economic activity that does harm, so you get a good understanding via the ecosystem. You will learn who are your stakeholders in a certain way. Yeah.
Exactly. And those are two sides of the same coin, these opportunities and these risks, and you need to understand it. And maybe to end our small part of this webinar is the thing that we always say is that please take into account all ecosystem services and start integrating that, because your analysis will change if you solely look at carbon and water services. Your analysis will change when you take on all the other services that the system delivers as well. And that opens up the door to new opportunities and to building the 21st century economy that we are in so dire need of. So
yeah, maybe to say, maybe not all, but start with 3. Just to have an easy start, but start with 3, because it will learn you about connections and how everything is connected. And maybe one last thing, it is on our way to COP16. We are, of course, thinking how can we also bring attention to this kind of work? So also for the audience, if people are planning things, having other webinars or other ideas, how we can cooperate to bring this kind of work further. Also, on our way to COP16, please let us all know. Yeah,
I fully underpin that message that let's work beyond our borders, because ecosystems don't stop at our borders, at our national borders as well. So with that, Vince, I guess our time is up. Yes. And of course, we are still here for the Q&A later on in this webinar, but for now, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline and Mieke, for the insightful discussion and for elaborating on the role of ecosystem services for the Biodiversity Plan, but also for the national strategies, the NBSAPs, on our way to COP16. And I really liked what, Caroline, what you mentioned. If there's also people who have ideas, who have insights, please share them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we can delve into these later on. So now we move to the next slide to 2 of my very close colleagues. We will dive into the ESVD, the structure and the content. As far as we know, it's the largest freely available database on the ecosystem, the monetary evaluation of ecosystem services, and serves as a valuable tool for researchers, policymakers, and other types of stakeholders to make the value of nature count in decision making. We've been very busy with improving and developing the ESVD, also in the context of the LNV project. So now I would like to give the floor to 2 very close colleagues of mine, Victoria, who is an ESVD program officer and ecosystem services specialist, and she dedicates a lot of her time on the ESVD, and she's thereby also very fundamental for the content of the ESVD. Also to Luc Brender, he's an environmental economist with affiliations with the VU, the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, and the University of Leibniz in Hanover, Germany, and a lead for the ESVD program. And together they will tell the narrative of the ESVD 2024 update. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vince. Can I see, please, the next slide? Is it me or is it for everyone? No, perfect, thank you. Okay, great. Okay, so hello everyone. I hope you can see the screen clearly and hear me well. So today, Luke and I will delve into the latest developments in ESVD, as Vince mentioned. Specifically, we'll discuss the ESVD data included in the latest update, which has become available today for all users on esvd.net. And we will provide you with an overview of the available data and highlight the latest improvements we've made to our database. And also, Luke will show you the latest functionality we have in our web interface, that is the value transfer tool. So next slide, please. Okay, it seems like it takes a while. Okay, so I can already start. As you may already know, the ESVD is a huge database that's free and accessible to everyone. It contains information, the value of ecosystem services and biomes across the world. And we are very, very, very happy to announce that we have reached the milestone of 10,000 value estimates, as the database currently holds over 10,800 records from more than 1,355 studies. So the database is always growing with frequent updates thanks to the funding we had from several projects that help us to increase the number of valuations in the database. And some data, so to make it easier for users to compare, over 70% of the data has been standardized to a common set of units for all beneficiaries at 2020 price levels. And to improve data quality, around 43% of the estimates in the database have been reviewed externally by experts. Also, we have a repository of valuation studies containing over 3,600 studies. So if you want to access all this data, you have to go to our web interface and log in esvd.net. And you can also find more information about ESVD at esvd.info. Next slide, please. Okay, seems like, oh no. So what can you find in ESVD since today? So in this slide, you can see the spatial distribution of the value estimates by study site. So as you can see, our studies are distributed across all regions, but some regions are more represented than others. Until now, Europe is the continent with more values, followed by Asia. But Africa, North and South America and Oceania are also represented. So in general, I think that the global coverage is pretty good, and it is important to consider that some areas of the world doesn't have that much research, and there's still a lot to be done. So to make sure we cover all regions, we try to even things out when it comes to which regions we focus on different projects. So for example, this last year, we got some funding from the Dutch Ministry of Nature and decided to do some research in South America and Africa, as we noticed that there wasn't much information from those areas in the database. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of the biomes that are covered in ESVD, we code information for 15 separate biomes, and we have a lot of information, a lot of data for marine ecosystems, especially for coral reefs, but also a lot of estimates for agricultural systems, also coastal systems. That includes a lot of information for mangroves, and as well as forests that have a considerable number of value estimates in our database, especially tropical and temperate forests. And you can see that for some biomes, the number of estimates becomes relatively low, such as polar, alpine, or subterranean. And I think that this reflects the extent of the economic evaluation literature and which biomes have been the focus of valuation studies. Next slide, please. So in terms of ecosystem services, you can see this overview that shows the number of value estimates per ecosystem service using the TIP classification. So as you can see, we have a lot of information on recreation and tourism services, but we also do for provisioning services such as food or raw materials, and existing and bequest values. And of course, as in the previous slides, shows that there's not much information for other ecosystem services which have not received much attention in the economic valuation literature. This doesn't mean that they are not important. It just means that there are fewer studies. And on the right side, you can see a graph that shows a fairly even representation across all categories. However, cultural is the most commonly found service in the ESVD. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is my final slide. And before I hand it over to Luke, I would like to mention that within the last year, we have been receiving feedback and interacting with our users, which we listen to and which also drives our development. And at the moment, we have over 4,800 users of our database. Most of them are academics, but it is also worth mentioning that private sector, public sector, and NGOs are common users of our data. Also, the main purpose of using the database is for research, education, cost-benefit analysis, and value transfer. So this interaction that we had with our users have helped us understand the need for a value transfer tool that Luke will speak about it within a minute, and the need for keep growing. And for this reason, we are currently exploring the possibility of using AI to increase the number of value points in ESVD. This will help us to address data gaps and obviously increase the quality. And as shown, the ESVD is used by many public actors for showing the benefits of accounting for ecosystem services and for restoring and conserving biodiversity. So in summary, for showing that nature is not a cost, but a benefit. And for this reason, we believe that ESVD has to be kept open, source, and freely available. Because it serves this public purpose and because of the international character of the ESVD, we believe that support and collaboration has to come from this direction. So thank you, everyone. I will now pass it to Luke, that he's going to explain you the value transfer tool that we have developed.
Thanks, Victoria. So yeah, I'll say a few words about this new functionality that we've added this year on the value transfer tool. So the motivation for developing this is really that conducting new primary valuation studies, as we record in the ESVD, well, they can be time-consuming, expensive, they require a lot of data and expertise, and also to some extent, generally, they're only really feasible to conduct at local scales, whereas the need for information on the value of ecosystem services might be needed quickly at a relatively low cost, and also at larger geographic scales covering larger numbers of sites. And so for that reason, there's a lot of interest in methods for transferring those values. So interest in value or benefit transfer, which involves transferring information from existing primary valuation studies or study sites to estimate the value of ecosystem services at new current policy sites. And to this end, then we've added this new functionality, a value transfer tool, to the ESVD.net web interface. So that can be found now. You can explore it together with the rest of the data. Currently, it's just available for a couple of biomes, so for tropical forests and agricultural land. But we're in the process of developing this, and we'll add more biomes soon. So next slide, please. So I'll explain briefly how this works. So what we've done, I'll explain it in the context of the value function for agricultural land. So what we've done is we've taken the data on the value of ecosystem services from agricultural land. Currently, that's 458 value estimates. Actually, it's probably more than that now because we've added more data since conducting this. So we take that data and then we use it in a meta-regression to estimate a value function. So this is relating the value of ecosystem services from agricultural land to a number of characteristics of the study site that's been valued. So this might be things, this includes things like the land use, the ecosystem service that's being valued, characteristics of the study site in terms of its area, its condition, the number of invasive species, and a number of other things, and also characteristics of the context in which the study site is located. So this includes variables such as population density and GDP per capita. So some of these explanatory variables are directly taken from information in the ESVD, and some are Thanks. Some are added to the ESV or added to the data using secondary data sources and a GIS and adding spatially referenced data on things like condition, number of invasive species, population density, and so on. So this estimated value function forms the basis of the value transfer tool. And what it allows a user to do is plug in the characteristics of the policy site in which they're interested in getting a value estimate for into the value transfer tool to estimate a value per hectare per year for their policy site that reflects the characteristics, specific characteristics and context of their site. Next slide, please. So to show what this looks like in the interface, what I've done here is entered into the value transfer tool the characteristics of an agricultural area, crop area in Ethiopia, for which we have a primary valuation estimate in the ESVD. So basically, what I've done is I've put in the characteristics of that site and the ecosystem service that's been valued, and this then allows me to press the calculate button at the bottom, and it runs this valued function to estimate a value per hectare per year for this specific site. Now, as a user, you might not have information about all of these specific characteristics for your policy site, and so there's an option you can see on the right-hand side that allows you to select a default value for each variable, which is the mean value for that variable for the biome that's being valued. So next slide, please. So this transfer tool can be used, as I just showed, to estimate a value per hectare per year, but it also can be used to show how that value might change with changes in the characteristics of the policy site. So, for example, if we invested in landscape restoration activities and increased the condition of the ecosystem. Previously, the value for that variable was 18 at the policy site. If we increased it to 27, which is the average value across our sample of agricultural areas, we get a higher value for the ecosystem service that's estimated. So it can be used to show how values change with variation in these characteristics. So we hope that this tool will be useful. And as I said before, we're developing it further, and we will add more biomes very soon. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Victoria, and also Luke, of course, for delving into the ESVD. And I think now that together, the presentation by Victoria and Luke laid the groundwork and provided great insights into what we are up to, what we have been up to within the ESVD team, and also how this can be relevant for policy, for example, with the value transfer tool. So now we're moving to the exciting phase of the webinar, the Q&A session. We are a little bit later, but I think that's perfectly fine. To the Q&A session, and maybe first some short notes on the panel. If you could move to the next slide. The panel will consist of Mieke, Caroline, Luke, Victoria, who all have been speaking, myself also, but also Dolf de Groot, founder of FSD and actually the predecessor of the ESVD, the TEEP database, and Philip Shakener, who's also part of the ESVD team. And during the Q&A, of course, I will give people, also want to give people the floor who have questions and or comments. And there's already quite some discussion and questions that have been popped up. But first, maybe I'll address one or two questions to kickstart the discussion, and then you can also raise your hand. Then you can unmute yourself if you get the turn and ask a question or make a comment. And maybe to start with a question or actually a remark by Kalia on, despite having several biodiversity hotspots in South America, the data for South America seems to be underestimated or seems to be understudied. Maybe if I can give a short, at least a start to an answer. Although I think it makes up now about 8% of our all our values in the ESVD, it's still about 2,000 values. So There is a lot of data, but of course it could be much more because of all these hotspots. And this, on the one hand, this relates to, okay, so what do our funders, what are their interests? In a recent LNV project, we've increased the number for South American continent a lot. But it also, I think this really pinpoints towards the what we are actually advocating in this webinar, the need for cross-boundary collaboration to increase the number of values in the database, also for these areas which are understudied maybe, and South America is maybe one of these areas, but there is also several other areas. And it also, I think, pinpoints towards what Luke just described, this value transfer tool, that although we probably need a lot more data, but we cannot never have all the data for all places on the square meter. The need for these value transfer functions and the value transfer tool that we have developed to also, if there's less data, that we can still use the whole of the ESVD with all the data that is there to make better estimations, also taking several social, economic, and biophysical characteristics into account. Anyone who wants to add something to this from the panel? I think everything has been said. Maybe an interesting question also from David Fletcher, and then we can open the floor also. How can the ESVD tool, or how can this tool, to move on the value transfer tool, calculate the value for pollution, remediation, mitigation, without any input to represent the level of pollution? This seems like a critical factor for determining the value. And maybe that also relates to another question on how do you measure condition in the value transfer tool. So maybe Luke, if you could elaborate on this.
Yeah, so yeah, at the moment, the value functions that we've estimated that underlie the value transfer tool, they don't include information or an explanatory variable measuring the level of pollution, but there are other variables that maybe relate to that, for example, ecosystem condition. So if you're looking specifically at how changes in the level of pollution affect the value of ecosystem services, that would be the way to get at it. How does the pollution affect ecosystem condition, and then adjust that factor or characteristic of the policy site you're looking at to try and see how the value might change with changes in condition.
All right, thank you, Luke. There's many more coming in, but I would also like to give the floor to someone who wants to voice. Yeah, Victoria.
Yeah, I would like to just clarify, because I see a question in the chat about studies from South America. We do code studies in different languages, so we have studies not only in English, but also in Dutch, German, Spanish, French. We try to include them, but obviously there's much more economic valuation literature in English.
Thank you, Victoria. That's indeed a good point. We have a very international team. So we indeed also aim to include studies from languages that are not English. And there's much more to include. I saw that someone raised their hand, and two people raised their hands. So we could first give the floor to Graham Simmons and then to Ian Dickey. So please, Graham, unmute yourself and.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for the seminar. Really interesting and timely, actually, in terms of thinking that we're doing. So I'm Graham Simons. I'm from the UK's Department for Environment and Rural Affairs, Food and Rural Affairs, I should say. So yeah, so it's very interesting. I mean, I just, I'm sorry if I'm jumping the queue with the questions here by coming in by raising a hand, but I'm interested in your thoughts on the kind of opportunities and the limitations for the use of this. You know, there are, for instance, like conversations that are going on around how we kind of understand nature positive impacts that we might have through policy, whether that's, I mean, that can be through specific programs, but it can also be, you know, all of our official development assistance, or, you know, global finance, and, it can be quite an aggregate macro level. And if I'm sort of wondering, well, could this be a way in which, or a tool that we can use to kind of basically capture and identify the aggregate impacts that we're having on nature, maybe in a country or something, or region. But I wonder if it actually it's sufficiently kind of the coverage is sufficient yet, and the values are sufficiently in place to enable us to do that, or whether you think whether there are certain limitations that could make it hard to draw conclusions from trying to pull together these sort of aggregate estimates. That's just a question I've got.
Yeah, thanks. That's I think a question that has very many different perspectives. Maybe related to the first part of your question, to the nature positive and how ecosystem services can, or how the ESVD maybe specifically, or ecosystem services more broadly, the monetary evaluation can assist there. Maybe Mika or Caroline would be excited to jump in.
Caroline, do you want to go first? No? Okay, yeah, I think this is a very relevant point you raised here. And this is why we are also stressing the point that we are looking for cross-national collaborations on the development of these kind of things. Because like Vince and Luke and Victoria have mentioned before, we are working very hard to expand the number of value estimates throughout the database, and we're looking for new creative tech solutions to do this. But in the end, we will never be able to cover the whole planet in these data points, and then they will change also over time. So what we need to develop is besides expanding the data set, we also need to develop sophisticated and advanced value transfer functions. So these are the first things that we've built in this. I think it's a giant step forward. We're really proud of it, actually, but it must not stop here. So we need to keep developing this, and we need to learn from each other, because we are kind of in the same problem, but also for every country and for every continent, the problems differ a bit. So we need this cross-national collaboration to develop it in the right way. Another point that I would like to make in answering your question is that there is a lot of work being done currently on the development of concepts like a gross ecosystem product. Understanding of the ecosystems and the values of nature for our societies and economies also gives us all the insight that the BNPs are not sufficient anymore, the GDPs, sorry, translating in my head. So how can we add the value? How can we appreciate our natural capital within these economic systems? I know that Wageningen Economic Research is also, we are together with them, we are working on how can we integrate these things. There are a lot of, Stockholm Resilience Center has done a lot of research on that. And this is also, of course, very relevant for the future to also collaborate as a global community on these things.
Thanks, Mika. Caroline, anything to add? Otherwise, we
only shortly, of course.
Yeah.
Because good to meet you. I mean, from the UK also has a lot of data on natural capital. Also, other countries are picking up, Ireland. So I think it's great if we learn more from one another. If we can even come to certain proxies instead of doing every place again. At the end of the day, it maybe won't be the precise number, but I think there's already data out there that you can start to work with. It doesn't have to be perfect to get the first grip, because the insights are so profound about the values, and we all know it in our gut, or not all, many of us know it in our gut, but then to see some of those numbers. So I think for some of the countries there's enough to start, and I think the UK is already working on this. Some of these is already incorporating it in the different policy work. So I'm even a bit jealous and reaching out. So yeah, learning and scaling up by learning from one another is, I think, key in this. So yeah.
Thanks, Caroline, for your addition. I think we should move on to the next. We are going a little bit late, but I would like to have the two people that have raised their hand to also add your comment or question. So please be to the point so we can get to both. And then I would first get to Ian, if you could please unmute yourself. And
yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Vince. Yeah, I'll try and ask two questions very quickly. One, is there a idea to exploit a synergy with the CEA ecosystem accounting process? For example, the Central Bank of Chile are starting to develop valuations. It might not be things that get published and into ESVD. That might not be their priority. And the second one, for Luc, in talking about primary studies, you said that maybe locally is there likely scope or scale, and I wonder whether there's a case to be made that it's more cost effective to do them at a larger scale, so they cost more money, but then they support an exponentially larger amount of value transfer and application. Thanks, and very useful discussions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your comments and questions. So Luc, if you could go ahead on the value transfer function tool, and then maybe Philip and Dolf shortly on the CRIA and the link also maybe with the ESVD, as both of you also together with Dolf wrote a paper on it, which can maybe be added to the chat.
Yeah, hi Ian, thanks for the questions. But if I may, Vince, just answer the first part question as well. And the CEA, yes, this is something we have in mind. We're working on. One of the challenges here is that many of the value estimates recorded in the ESVD are welfare values, whereas for compatibility with the CEA or with the system of national accounts, we need to be able to estimate exchange values. So what we're working on now is adding more information to the ESVD so that we can estimate value functions that allow us to predict exchange values as well as welfare values. And on the scope of the kind of primary valuation research to enable value transfers, yeah, I think that's a good idea. If when conducting a primary valuation study, you have an idea, an eye already on how can this be used for value transfer. I think the challenge is just scale. I mean, the point being that values are highly context specific and localized. Having a primary valuation study that covers a large number of different contexts in order to cover that variation is just becomes expensive generally. So that's why I think many of the existing studies tend to be small, focus on a specific area, rather than covering large numbers of study sites.
Thank you, Luc, for your answer. Maybe for Philip and Dolf, if they want to add about this link between the ESVD and the CAA, because it's a relevant link. Philip,
maybe I shortly add a bit of advertisement for ourselves. So we recently published this paper in the One Ecosystem journal, where we particularly touched on this topic, how to use the ESVD for network capital accounting. And yeah, as Luc pointed out, you have to control for the different value concepts that are used in different primary valuation studies. And earlier this year, we ran an update for the ESVD where we included all the German studies. In there, we have particularly tested variables to account for different value concepts. And now with upcoming updates, we plan to extend the coding of these variables to all valuation that are already within the ESVD. And this then allows it to test to what extent different value concepts statistically significant have an effect on the value estimate, and thereby, control for this difference, and then particularly make estimate that that represent exchange values as demanded by the network capital accounting framework.
Thanks, Philip. Maybe if we can get Johannes, if you can ask your question in 1 minute or very shortly, and then we can give a short answer, and then we go to the call for action because we were running a bit over time, but this discussion is also nice. So very shortly.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. One question on the use of the economic values that is currently happening for financial assessments, like impacts of companies, but also with regards to dependencies of financial institutions that run economic valuation across supply chains at a large global scale. And of course, at that level and course analysis, average values are used, and a lot of the rules that or kind of like criteria for benefit transfer are, of course, don't apply there, or they do apply, but they are not kind of like applied in that context. What is your feeling about this? Do you think that there are different levels of decision making where such values can provide guidance, and there are different criteria that apply for the use?
Thanks, Johannes, for your question. Maybe if Dolf, if you would have an answer, then it would be nice if you could give some answer in 1 or 2 sentences, and then we move on. You're muted still. You're still muted, Dolf.
Not hearing
You're still.
you.
No, Dolf, you're still muted. No, I think that.
I found
in
it, and I
2
can
sentences, Dolf.
Yeah, no, I just in 1 sentence. I mean, I have to really keep it really short. But a simple answer would be: it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. I mean, what we are looking for is kind of to at least internalize some of those values into the externalities into the economic system. And that's why I was also pleased with the remark about the SEEA, because in your introduction, Vince and Mika and Carolina emphasized that we need systemic change. And for that, this adoption of the ecosystem accounting and calculating natural capital is so essential. And in ESVD, we have this option that you can select values that are linked to the SEEA ecosystem service system.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I have to keep it really short, but I hope my first remark, better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. Yes. You know what I'm trying to say with that.
Yeah, thanks, Dolf. I think that's a great also summary and kind of starting point. Now, for the final minutes, I would like to move to the call for action by Esmee Kooijman, policymaker for the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Safety since January 2024. And we've had great collaborations with the ministry over the past years on the ESVD, and Esmee brings in promising new elan and energy. So excited to have you here at the webinar. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vince. And yes, I will try to keep it brief as well. I just like to share a few reflections on the importance of international collaboration when we're talking about ecosystem service valuation and on the ESVD in particular. So in the Netherlands, we've recently been drafted our first national biodiversity strategy and action plan. And we definitely have come to realize that international collaboration will be fundamental for us to reach our goals. And that's not just for nature and biodiversity itself, but also for our economies. Because of course, our economies globally are dependent on nature and natural resources. And in the EU, this is even 48% of the economy. So that's quite a high number. And then if we look at a country like the Netherlands, also, a lot of these resources are kind of imported. So we have an impact also on nature and biodiversity beyond our borders. So that's, I think, an important thing to note as well. So like the combination of the dependencies on nature of our economy lead, of course, to serious risk for us people, but also for companies, as well as kind of macroeconomic and financial stability. So in order kind of to work on this, like ecosystem service valuation is vital for this transition to a nature positive economy. And we can use this kind of as an approach to embed nature, not only in our decision making, but also to get more insight in the impacts and dependencies on our economies, as well as in kind of the value of alternative nature positive economic activities. So for example, going from monoculture agriculture to regenerative agriculture, and kind of seeing how the benefits, etc., then change. And global data sets like the ESVD, where these ecosystem service valuations are from scientific studies, they're collected and they're standardized, are very important tools for country to implement nature and biodiversity strategies. We've heard from Caroline and Mieke, I think very interesting discussion as well towards COP, how we can implement and use this type of data. And we in the Netherlands, specifically the Ministry of Agriculture and Nature, has been supporting the ESVD for a couple of years now, and we see a clear need for this cross-national collaboration on this topic, specifically when we talk about data collection and the standardization of it. And moreover, it is important that this database continues to be fed by the global scientific community, and that the data stays of high quality and stays accessible to all. So yeah, to quickly summarize, it would be great, I think, to collaborate further on the development of the ESVD, and this is kind of my invitation to you. So feel free to reach out to me, to Vince or Mieke from the FSD, to discuss possible collaboration on this. And I think I give the floor to Vince. Sorry, it was very quick, and I tried to keep it very short.
You're muted, Vince.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for also the message, and also thanks, of course, Esme. I think it was really, really good, really to the point, and also really what we need. We really need this cross-country or international collaboration to keep the ESVD open source, to keep it running, and to keep it to account for nature in different forms of decision making. And that's also where I would like to close it. Maybe if you could put on the next slide, we have 1 more minute for the, I will not go really over the main messages, but I think you can read them here. What is important is that this is a great team effort. So thanks to the whole ESVD team, everybody who was here, Janneke also, Diane and Iskra from ESP, and of course Co-Capacity, Joost, Lieshout and Philip de Braaf for developing ESVD.net website. And I think what Esme mentioned, this open source and free character of the ESVD is very important and very valuable also for policy and also very relevant for policy. So if you have any questions on collaboration, get in touch with us. We will forward you the slides, and we will also get back to the questions that you still had. And as a final promotional activity, please take a look at the Ecosystem Services Partnership if you have not yet done so, and join the ESP Europe Conference here in Wageningen in November 2024. It's a couple of weeks after the COP, so you have some time to recuperate and to get back to and reflect on what you've learned and what you take this to the conference. And I think I would like to end with a famous quote from Winston Churchill. We are in a biodiversity crisis, and as he once said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So we really need to step up and act. So I would suggest to take some minutes after the webinar, reflect on what you've heard and how you can take this in your work to make nature count. So for now, thanks again. We will get back to you, and a good rest of the day. Thank you and bye-bye.